In the summer of 1540, the second most powerful man in England, after the king himself, watched his world collapse in the span of mere weeks. Thomas Cromwell, the blacksmith's son who had risen to become Earl of Essex and Henry VIII's chief minister, would learn that standing too close to absolute power could be more dangerous than keeping one's distance. His fate remains one of history's starkest warnings in the Tudor court. Today's indispensable advisor could be tomorrow's condemned traitor. This was the man who engineered Cardinal Wolsey's downfall, masterminded Henry's break from Rome, and sent countless others to the scaffold. Yet the same brutal machinery of Tudor justice that he had perfected would soon be turned against him. What makes Cromwell's fall so chilling is not only its speed, but the calculated cruelty with which it was carried out by the very monarch he had served with such ruthless loyalty. Cromwell's unlikely ascent began far from courtly halls. Born around 1485 in Putney, to a blacksmith and a brewer, young Thomas fled England after a violent altercation with his father. On the continent, he fought as a mercenary, studied the politics of Machiavelli, and mastered the world of trade and finance. By the time he returned, Cromwell had wealth connections and a formidable reputation. His legal brilliance caught the eye of Cardinal Wolsey in the 1520s, particularly during Henry VIII's desperate efforts to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. When Wolsey fell in 1529, Cromwell remarkably emerged stronger, carefully detaching himself from his disgraced master and proving his indispensability to the king. By 1532, he had become Henry's chief secretary and soon the true architect of the English Reformation. Cromwell dismantled centuries of religious tradition, not out of piety, but out of political calculation. The break with Rome solved Henry's marital problems and filled the crown's coffers with the vast wealth of the monasteries. His methods were efficient, ruthless, and through spies and informants, Cromwell built what many call the first modern intelligence service. He understood that information was power and wielded it mercilessly. His power reached its peak in 1540 when he was created Earl of Essex. Yet, by then, his success had bred enemies among the nobility who despised this commoner's rise. They knew Henry's favor was fickle, and they waited for the moment when the wind would turn. That moment came with Cromwell's greatest miscalculation, arranging Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, intended as a Protestant alliance. The match collapsed the instant Henry met his bride and declared her a Flanders mare. To Henry, it was Cromwell's betrayal, and to his enemies it was the perfect weapon. Led by the Duke of Norfolk, the conservative faction moved swiftly. They tied Cromwell's Protestant sympathies to charges of heresy and treason, whispering that he had deceived the king and endangered England. Norfolk's niece, the young Catherine Howard, had caught Henry's eye, and her rise meant Cromwell's destruction was inevitable. On June 10, 1540, the trap was sprung. At a routine council meeting, Norfolk rose and accused Cromwell of treason. Guards seized him on the spot. The Garter insignia, England's highest honor, was ripped from his chest. His staff of office shattered, his sword removed. In minutes, the most powerful man in England after the king was reduced to a chained prisoner. Dragged to the Tower, Cromwell endured the same merciless interrogation methods he himself had refined. His correspondence with reformers was twisted into evidence of treason. His friends abandoned him. Parliament passed a bill of attainder, condemning him to death without trial. In his final weeks, Cromwell was forced to help annul the very marriage that had doomed him. He clung to hope that Henry might show mercy. But on July 28, 1540, the same day Henry married Catherine Howard, Cromwell was led to Tower Hill. Once the master of Tudor politics, he now walked in chains through jeering crowds. Granted the mercy of beheading, he died with a single blow. His head was displayed on London Bridge, his body buried in an unmarked grave. Within months, Henry bitterly regretted his decision, realizing he had destroyed the one man capable of holding his kingdom together. Cromwell's legacy remains fiercely debated. To some, He was a visionary reformer, to others, a ruthless tyrant. Yet his story endures because it embodies timeless truths: how power corrupts, how ambition destroys, and how quickly fortune turns in the shadow of absolute authority. The man who built the machinery of Tudor power became its most famous victim. In Cromwell's rise and terrifying fall, we glimpse the price of serving a king who answered only to himself, had learned their craft from watching his methods. In the brutal world of Tudor politics, Cromwell had made himself indispensable, but he had also made himself friendless. The beginning of Cromwell's downfall can be traced to a single diplomatic miscalculation that would prove catastrophic. In his eagerness to secure Henry's fourth marriage and forge a Protestant alliance with the German princes, Cromwell had negotiated the king's betrothal to Anne of Cleves without ensuring Henry's personal approval of the bride. The marriage, contracted in late 1539, was politically sound, but personally disastrous for the king. When Henry first laid eyes on Anne of Cleves in January 1540, his reaction was immediate and devastating for Cromwell's future. The king, who had expected a beautiful bride based on Hollin's flattering portrait, instead found a woman he considered plain and unsuitable. Henry's famous description of Anne as a Flanders mayor reflected not just his personal disappointment, but his growing resentment toward the minister who had arranged the match. The political implications of Henry's marital dissatisfaction extended far beyond personal preference. The marriage represented a commitment to the Protestant German princes at a time when Henry was reconsidering his foreign policy options. The Catholic powers of Europe, particularly Emperor Charles V, were offering attractive alternatives that would require abandoning the Protestant alliance that Cromwell had so carefully constructed. Cromwell found himself trapped between his commitment to the German alliance and his need to satisfy the king's growing desire to escape his unwanted marriage. His attempts to find legal grounds for annulment were complicated by the very thoroughness with which he had negotiated the original marriage contract. The political framework he had created to support the match now became an obstacle to dissolving it. The king's dissatisfaction with his marriage became entangled with broader questions about religious policy. Conservative nobles led by the Duke of Norfolk began advocating for a rapprochement with Catholic Europe and a reversal of some of Cromwell's more radical reforms. They argued that Cromwell's Protestant policies had isolated England and created unnecessary enemies among the traditional European powers. Henry's attraction to Catherine Howard, Norfolk's young niece, provided the conservative faction with a powerful weapon against Cromwell. The possibility of a fifth marriage offered Henry both personal satisfaction and political flexibility, but it required removing the obstacles that Cromwell's policies had created. The minister, who had once seemed indispensable, now appeared to be the primary impediment to the king's happiness. Cromwell's response to this crisis revealed both his political acumen and his ultimate vulnerability. He attempted to orchestrate Anne of Cleves' agreement to an annulment, while simultaneously trying to maintain his influence over religious policy. However, his enemies had learned from his own methods, and they began building a case against him, using the same techniques he had employed against others. The speed with which Cromwell's position deteriorated reflected the precarious nature of political power in Henry's court. Within months of being elevated to the earldom, he found himself facing accusations of heresy and treason from men who had previously deferred to his authority. The very efficiency of the governmental system he had created now worked against him, as his enemies used his own administrative methods to document his alleged crimes. The plot against Thomas Cromwell was orchestrated with the same methodical precision that had characterized his own rise to power. The Duke of Norfolk, representing the conservative Catholic faction, recognized that Cromwell's fall required more than royal displeasure. It demanded a carefully constructed legal case that would justify the extreme punishment Norfolk's party sought to inflict. Norfolk's strategy centered on exploiting Henry's growing paranoia about religious orthodoxy and personal loyalty. The Duke understood that accusations of heresy would resonate with a king who had spent years defining himself as the defender of true religion against both papal authority and Protestant extremism. By portraying Cromwell as a secret radical who had manipulated royal policy for his own ideological ends, Norfolk could transform the king's personal irritation into righteous fury. The conservative faction began gathering evidence of Cromwell's correspondence with Protestant reformers across Europe, particularly his communications with the more radical elements in German Lutheran circles. Letters that had once represented prudent diplomatic intelligence gathering were now reinterpreted as evidence of treasonous conspiracy. Cromwell's network of Protestant contacts, previously viewed as valuable assets, became proof of his dangerous religious sympathies. Stephen Gardiner, the conservative Bishop of Winchester, played a crucial role in developing the theological case against Cromwell. Gardiner had long resented Cromwell's influence over religious policy and saw the minister's current vulnerability as an opportunity to reassert clerical authority over the English Church. His scholarly reputation lent credibility to accusations that Cromwell had promoted heretical doctrines contrary to the king's own theological preferences. The timing of the conspiracy was carefully coordinated with Henry's infatuation with Catherine Howard. Norfolk understood that his niece's influence over the king created a unique opportunity to strike at Cromwell. While Henry was emotionally vulnerable and politically distracted, Catherine's youth and beauty provided a stark contrast to Anne of Cleves, reinforcing Henry's sense that Cromwell had deliberately deceived him about the German marriage. Contemporary observers noted the sudden change in atmosphere at court as news of the developing plot spread through whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Courtiers who had previously sought Cromwell's favor began distancing themselves from the minister, recognizing the signs of an impending fall. The same political instincts that had brought many of them to prominence now warned them to abandon their former patron before his destruction engulfed them as well. Cromwell himself seems to have been initially unaware of the full extent of the conspiracy against him. His confidence in his own indispensability blinded him to the careful preparation of his enemies, and his focus on managing the immediate crisis of the royal marriage prevented him from recognizing the broader threat to his position. This oversight would prove fatal in the ruthless environment of Henry's court. The final elements of the plot were put in place during the spring of 1540 as Norfolk and his allies prepared to present their case to the king. They had assembled what they considered sufficient evidence of Cromwell's heretical beliefs and treasonous communications, and they had secured the support of key court officials who would be necessary to implement their plan. All that remained was choosing the optimal moment to spring their carefully prepared trap. The morning of June 10, 1540, began like any other for Thomas Cromwell. As Lord Privy Seal and recently created Earl of Essex, he attended the regular council meeting at Westminster, discussing routine matters of state with his fellow councillors. Nothing in his demeanor suggested awareness of the catastrophe that was about to unfold, though some observers would later claim to have noticed unusual tension in the room. The trap was sprung with devastating suddenness. In the middle of the council proceedings, the Duke of Norfolk rose from his seat and began reading formal charges of treason and heresy against Cromwell. The accusations were comprehensive, alleging that the Earl had promoted heretical doctrines, maintained treasonous correspondence with foreign enemies, and deliberately deceived the king about matters of vital importance to the realm. Cromwell's initial reaction was one of shocked disbelief. The man who had orchestrated similar scenes against others now found himself the target of the same legal machinery he had helped to perfect. His attempts to defend himself were cut short as Norfolk commanded the guards to arrest him immediately. The speed of the proceedings left no opportunity for the elaborate legal maneuvering that had characterized Cromwell's own prosecutions of his enemies. The symbolism of the arrest was carefully calculated to humiliate the fallen minister. The garter insignia recently bestowed upon him as England's highest honor was stripped from his person in full view of the assembled council. His staff of office was broken and cast aside, and his ceremonial sword was removed. Traditional gestures that marked his complete fall from grace and his transformation from peer of the realm to common prisoner. Contemporary accounts describe the stunned silence that followed Cromwell's arrest. Counselors who had worked closely with him for years sat frozen in their seats, afraid that any show of sympathy might be interpreted as complicity in his alleged crimes. The atmosphere in the chamber was described as oppressive, filled with the recognition that the most powerful man in England after the king had just been reduced to a helpless prisoner in a matter of minutes. The physical act of placing Cromwell in chains carried particular significance in the context of Tudor political culture. Chains were not merely restraints, but symbols of disgrace, traditionally reserved for common criminals rather than peers of the realm. By ordering Cromwell to be chained immediately, Norfolk ensured that his humiliation would be complete and visible to all who witnessed his removal from the council chamber. News of the arrest spread through London with remarkable speed, creating a sensation among both the court and the general population. Citizens who had watched Cromwell's rise, with a mixture of admiration and resentment, now gathered in the streets to witness his fall. The speed of the transformation from power to powerlessness served as a stark reminder of the precarious nature of political fortune in Henry's England. The psychological impact on Cromwell himself appears to have been severe. Witnesses described him as appearing aged and broken as he was led away in chains. The confident administrator, replaced by a confused and frightened man who seemed unable to comprehend the magnitude of his reversal. The systematic destruction of his carefully constructed persona began with his arrest and would continue throughout his imprisonment and trial. Cromwell's imprisonment in the Tower of London marked the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological and physical degradation designed to break his spirit and extract the confessions his enemies required. The Tower, which had served as the final destination for so many of his own victims, now became his own prison, its walls echoing with the ghosts of those he had sent to their deaths. The conditions of his confinement were deliberately harsh, designed to contrast sharply with the luxury he had enjoyed as one of England's most powerful men. Gone were the fine clothes, rich foods, and comfortable quarters that had marked his elevated status. Instead, he found himself in a cramped stone cell, poorly lit and inadequately heated, wearing the rough garments of a common prisoner. His interrogators employed techniques that Cromwell himself had refined during his years as Henry's chief minister. They understood that physical torture, while effective, was less valuable than psychological pressure applied systematically over time. The knowledge that his former methods were being used against him added a particularly cruel dimension to his suffering, as he recognized the expertise of his tormentors. The questioning focused on two primary areas: his alleged heretical beliefs and his supposed treasonous communications with foreign powers. His interrogators possessed extensive documentation of his correspondence, much of it obtained through the same intelligence networks he had established. They used his own words against him, showing how letters written for legitimate diplomatic purposes could be reinterpreted as evidence of treasonous intent. The psychological pressure was intensified by calculated visits from former allies who had abandoned him since his arrest. These encounters served multiple purposes. They reinforced his isolation, gathered intelligence about his mental state, and provided opportunities for his enemies to attempt to extract damaging admissions. The parade of former friends and colleagues who now treated him as a stranger contributed to his growing sense of despair. Physical deprivation played a crucial role in weakening his resistance. The poor quality of prison food, combined with the stress of his situation, led to rapid deterioration in his health. Contemporary accounts describe him as becoming gaunt and pale, his formerly robust appearance giving way to the hollow-eyed look of a man under extreme duress. The interrogation sessions were conducted with professional efficiency, reflecting the techniques Cromwell had developed for use against religious dissident and political opponents. His questioners understood the importance of varying their approach, alternating between aggressive confrontation and seemingly sympathetic concern. This psychological manipulation was designed to confuse and disorient him, making him more vulnerable to making the admissions they sought. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of his imprisonment was the knowledge that Henry VIII, the king he had served so faithfully, had apparently abandoned him completely. No royal messenger brought words of comfort or hope for clemency. The silence from the court was more devastating than any physical torture, as it confirmed his complete isolation and the hopelessness of his situation. Rather than subjecting Cromwell to a traditional trial, his enemies chose to destroy him through a Bill of Attainder, a legislative act that declared him guilty of treason without the need for formal legal proceedings. This method offered several advantages to his persecutors. It avoided the inconvenience of presenting evidence in open court, eliminated the possibility of an effective defense, and ensured that the outcome would be determined by political considerations rather than legal technicalities. The Bill of Attainder represented a particularly cynical use of parliamentary procedure, transforming what should have been a deliberative legislative body into an instrument of personal destruction. The charges outlined in the bill were comprehensive but vague, alleging that Cromwell had committed and done treasons, murders, robberies, and other most heinous offenses without providing specific details that could be challenged or refuted. The religious charges formed the core of the case against him. The bill accused him of promoting heretical doctrines, protecting known heretics, and undermining the king's authority in matters of faith. These accusations were particularly damaging because they touched on Henry's deep concern about religious orthodoxy and his desire to be seen as a defender of true Christian doctrine against both papal authority and Protestant extremism. The treason charges were more specific, focusing on his alleged correspondence with foreign enemies and his supposed attempts to manipulate royal policy for his own benefit. The bill claimed that he had traitorously arranged the king's marriage to Anne of Cleves, despite knowing that it would be politically and personally disadvantageous to the realm. This charge was particularly clever because it transformed what had been a diplomatic miscalculation into an act of deliberate betrayal. The parliamentary proceedings were carefully stage-managed to ensure the desired outcome. Cromwell's supporters in Parliament, intimidated by the fate of their former patron, remained silent rather than risk their own positions by defending him. The few voices raised in his defense were quickly silenced by reminders of his alleged crimes and the king's displeasure with anyone who questioned the proceedings. The speed with which the bill moved through Parliament reflected the political momentum behind Cromwell's destruction. Both houses of Parliament passed the measure with minimal debate, their members understanding that opposition would be interpreted as disloyalty to the king. The legislative process, which normally involved careful consideration of evidence and extensive discussion, was reduced to a formality designed to provide legal cover for a predetermined outcome. The bill's provisions were comprehensive in their scope, not only condemning Cromwell to death, but also confiscating all his property and stripping his family of any claim to his titles or estates. This complete forfeit ensured that his destruction would be both personal and dynastic, eliminating any possibility that his descendants might seek to restore the family's fortunes in the future. The psychological impact on Cromwell of learning about the Bill of Attainder was devastating. The realization that he would be condemned without trial by the same parliamentary system he had used to legitimize Henry's break with Rome represented the ultimate irony of his situation. The legislative machinery he had helped to create and operate was now being used to destroy him with ruthless efficiency. The period between Cromwell's condemnation and execution was marked by a systematic campaign to extract every possible advantage from his desperate situation. His enemies understood that a man facing certain death might be willing to provide valuable information or perform final services in exchange for the faint hope of clemency or a more merciful death. The most significant demand placed upon the condemned minister was his assistance in annulling Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. Despite his own desperate circumstances, Cromwell was required to use his legal expertise and diplomatic connections to facilitate the dissolution of the marriage. He had originally negotiated this requirement added a particularly cruel dimension to his final weeks, as he was forced to participate in undoing his own work while awaiting execution. His cooperation in the annulment proceedings was secured through a combination of hope and desperation. Though he understood that his death was virtually certain, the possibility that exceptional service might earn him a reprieve provided motivation to comply with his captor's demands. His detailed knowledge of the marriage negotiations made him uniquely qualified to identify legal grounds for dissolution, and his former diplomatic contacts could still be valuable in securing an off-class cooperation. The psychological toll of these final weeks was evident in contemporary descriptions of Cromwell's appearance and demeanor. Visitors to his cell reported that he had aged dramatically, his hair turning white, and his face becoming deeply lined with stress and despair. The confident administrator, who had once commanded the respect and fear of England's nobility, had been reduced to a broken man pleading for his life. Religious considerations played an increasingly important role in Cromwell's thoughts as his execution approached. The man who had been accused of heresy began seeking spiritual comfort from Protestant ministers, attempting to reconcile his earthly failures with his hope for divine mercy. These religious consultations provided some measure of psychological relief, while also serving his enemy's purposes by reinforcing the narrative of his theological errors. His attempts to communicate with family and friends were strictly controlled, with all correspondence subject to scrutiny by his jailers. The few letters that survive from this period reveal a man struggling to maintain dignity while acknowledging the reality of his situation. His communications with his son Gregory were particularly poignant, as he attempted to provide guidance for a young man who would inherit the stigma of his father's disgrace. The practical arrangements for his execution became a subject of intense discussion among court officials. The method of death, whether by hanging, drawing, and quartering, as befitted a traitor, or by the more merciful beheading, reserved for nobility, would send important signals about the king's final judgment of his former minister. The decision would reflect not only on Cromwell's perceived status, but also on Henry's character as a ruler. Throughout these final weeks, Cromwell maintained a desperate hope that Henry might yet relent and spare his life. This hope was carefully nurtured by his enemies, who understood that a man expecting clemency would be more compliant than one who had accepted his fate. The psychological manipulation continued until the very end, ensuring that Cromwell's final weeks were marked by emotional torment as well as physical confinement. On the morning of July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led from his cell in the Tower of London to face his final public appearance. The date had been carefully chosen to coincide with Henry's marriage to Catherine Howard, ensuring that the king's joy would not be marred by dwelling on the unpleasant necessity of executing his former minister. This timing reflected the calculated cruelty that had characterized every aspect of Cromwell's downfall. The journey from cell to scaffold was deliberately designed as a final humiliation. Cromwell, who had once traveled in state as one of England's most powerful nobles, now walked in chains through the jeering crowds that had gathered to witness his death. The contrast between his former magnificence and present degradation provided a stark lesson in the transitory nature of worldly power that was not lost on observers. The scaffold had been erected on Tower Hill, the traditional site for the execution of traitors and high-ranking criminals. The elevated platform ensured that Cromwell's death would be visible to the large crowd that had assembled, turning his final moments into a public spectacle designed to reinforce royal authority and satisfy popular bloodlust. The theatrical nature of Tudor executions transformed legal punishment into political theater. Contemporary accounts describe Cromwell's demeanor on the scaffold as a complex mixture of dignity and despair. though he maintained the composure expected of a nobleman facing death. Witnesses noted the tremor in his voice as he delivered his final speech. His words were carefully chosen to avoid any suggestion of innocence that might be interpreted as criticism of the king's justice, while still attempting to preserve some measure of personal dignity. The execution itself was conducted with the efficiency that characterized all aspects of Tudor justice. Cromwell had been granted the relative mercy of beheading rather than the hanging, drawing, and quartering prescribed for traitors, a concession that reflected either residual royal favor or simple expedience. The executioner's axe, wielded by an experienced professional, ended his life with a single blow. The immediate aftermath of the execution revealed the calculated nature of the entire proceeding. Cromwell's head was displayed on London Bridge alongside those of other traitors, serving as a warning to potential enemies of the crown. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, denying him the elaborate funeral that would have befitted his former rank and ensuring that his physical remains would provide no focus for future opposition. News of the execution spread rapidly throughout England and across Europe, generating a complex mixture of satisfaction, fear, and reflection among those who had witnessed Cromwell's meteoric rise and precipitous fall. Foreign ambassadors reported the event to their masters as evidence of the dangerous unpredictability of English politics and the personal cost of serving an absolute monarch. The speed and efficiency of Cromwell's destruction served as a powerful demonstration of royal power and a warning to potential challenges. The man, who had seemed indispensable just months earlier, had been reduced to a severed head on a pike, his family scattered, his property confiscated, and his name synonymous with treachery. The completeness of his obliteration reflected the systematic nature of Tudor justice when applied to enemies of the crown. The historical record surrounding Thomas Cromwell's final days and execution is complicated by conflicting contemporary accounts that reflect the political divisions and personal biases of their authors. These contradictory narratives have created ongoing debates among historians about the true nature of Cromwell's crimes, the fairness of his trial, and the circumstances of his death. Catholic contemporary observers, writing from the perspective of those who opposed Cromwell's religious policies, tended to portray his downfall as divine justice for his role in dismantling England's traditional religious institutions. These accounts emphasized his humble origins and alleged theological errors, presenting his destruction as the inevitable consequence of his presumption in challenging established authority. Their narratives often included claims about his behavior during imprisonment that portrayed him as craven and desperate. Protestant writers conversely viewed Cromwell as a martyr to the cause of religious reform who had been destroyed by conservative enemies seeking to reverse his progressive policies. These accounts emphasized his administrative competence and his role in freeing England from papal authority, while portraying his downfall as the result of court intrigue rather than genuine legal violations. They often questioned the legitimacy of the charges against him and suggested that his execution represented a miscarriage of justice. Foreign diplomatic sources provide a third perspective, focusing on the international implications of Cromwell's fall rather than domestic religious considerations. These accounts often emphasize the impact of his destruction on England's foreign relations, particularly the damage to the Protestant alliance he had worked to construct. Continental question of Cromwell's alleged heretical beliefs remains particularly contentious among historians. While there is evidence that he maintained correspondence with Protestant reformers and promoted religious policies that challenged traditional practices, the extent of his personal theological commitments remains unclear. Some scholars argue that his religious policies were purely pragmatic, designed to serve royal interests rather than promote specific doctrinal positions. Recent historical scholarship has attempted to understand Cromwell's downfall within the broader context of Tudor political culture and the specific dynamics of Henry VII's court. These analyses suggest that his destruction was the result of multiple factors, including policy disagreements, personal rivalries, and the inherent instability of a political system based on royal favor. This approach emphasizes structural factors, rather than individual guilt or innocence. The continuing scholarly debate about Cromwell's fate reflects broader questions about the nature of Tudor justice and the relationship between law and politics in early modern England. His case exemplifies the challenges historians face when attempting to distinguish between legitimate legal proceedings and political persecution in a system where the distinction between the two was often deliberately obscured. Within months of Thomas Cromwell's execution, Henry VIII began to display signs of regret about his decision to destroy his former minister. The king's remorse was not driven by moral considerations, but by practical recognition that he had eliminated the most competent administrator in his government at a time when effective governance was desperately needed. The administrative chaos that followed Cromwell's death made his former efficiency painfully obvious to all who had to deal with the consequences. The immediate problems created by Cromwell's absence became apparent in the handling of religious policy, foreign relations, and financial administration. The king discovered that his former minister's systematic approach to governance had created a level of organizational efficiency that none of his replacements could match. The conservative nobles who had orchestrated Cromwell's downfall proved far better at destroying their enemy than at replacing his administrative functions. Henry's famous complaint that he had been served by false accusations in the matter of Cromwell's execution revealed both his growing awareness of his mistake and his characteristic inability to accept personal responsibility for his decisions. The king's tendency to blame his advisors for the consequences of his own choices had reached its logical extreme in the destruction of the advisor who had served him most effectively. This pattern of behavior would continue throughout the remainder of his reign. The long-term consequences of Cromwell's destruction extended far beyond the immediate administrative difficulties. His death marked the end of the systematic approach to religious reform that had characterized the early years of the English Reformation. Without his guiding hand, religious policy became increasingly erratic, reflecting the king's personal theological uncertainties rather than any coherent strategic vision. The international implications of Cromwell's fall were equally significant. His carefully constructed Protestant alliance collapsed almost immediately after his execution, leaving England diplomatically isolated and vulnerable to Catholic opposition. The German princes, who had viewed him as their primary English contact, concluded that Henry's religious policies were unreliable, and they began seeking alternative arrangements that excluded England from their strategic calculations. Modern historical assessment of Cromwell's legacy has undergone significant revision as scholars have gained access to previously unavailable documentary sources. Earlier historians, influenced by Protestant apologetics or Catholic polemics, tended to view him as either a heroic reformer or a destructive radical. Contemporary scholarship presents a more nuanced picture of a pragmatic administrator whose policies were driven by practical considerations rather than ideological commitments. The methods Cromwell employed in his rise to power and his exercise of authority have attracted particular attention from historians interested in the development of modern governmental techniques. His use of intelligence networks, propaganda, and systematic legal procedures anticipated many features of modern state administration. His ability to coordinate complex policy implementations across multiple governmental departments demonstrated an understanding of bureaucratic efficiency that was centuries ahead of its time. The brutality of his destruction serves as a reminder of the personal costs of political participation in early modern Europe. The same ruthless efficiency that characterized his administrative methods was applied to his elimination, creating a perfect circle of cause and effect that historians have found both fascinating and terrifying. His story continues to resonate, with modern audiences because it illustrates timeless themes about power, ambition, and the price of political involvement. The terrifying final days of Thomas Cromwell offer a window into the brutal realities of power in Tudor England, where proximity to absolute authority could transform loyal service into mortal danger with shocking suddenness. His story serves as one of history's most compelling examples of how quickly fortune can change in the corridors of power, and how the very skills that elevate a person to greatness can become the instruments of their destruction. What makes Cromwell's fate particularly chilling is not simply the speed of his fall, but the systematic nature of his destruction. The same governmental machinery he had helped to create and refine was turned against him with devastating efficiency. His enemies understood his methods so well because they had watched him employ them against others, and they applied his own techniques with merciless precision. The student had become the master, and the master had become the victim. The psychological dimensions of his downfall reveal the human cost of political ambition in an absolute monarchy. The man who had confidently manipulated the levers of power found himself helpless against the same forces he had once controlled. His final weeks, marked by desperate attempts to secure clemency through continued service, demonstrate the terrible vulnerability of those who stake everything on royal favor. The isolation and despair he experienced in his final days serve as a stark reminder of the personal price of political involvement. The conflicting historical accounts of Cromwell's character and crimes reflect the continuing power of his story to generate debate and disagreement. Whether viewed as a progressive reformer, destroyed by conservative enemies, or as an overreaching administrator who finally exceeded his authority, his fate continues to fascinate historians and popular audiences alike. The ambiguity surrounding his true character only adds to the enduring appeal of his story. Perhaps most significantly, Cromwell's destruction illustrates the inherent instability of political systems based on personal rule rather than institutional constraints. The arbitrary nature of his condemnation and execution demonstrates how quickly legal procedures can be subordinated to political convenience when sufficient power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual. His case serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute authority and the vulnerability of those who serve it. The legacy of his administrative innovations, particularly his development of modern governmental techniques, has outlasted the memory of his political failures. While his name became synonymous with treachery in the immediate aftermath of his execution, modern historians recognize his contributions to the development of efficient governmental administration. The irony that his most lasting achievements were accomplished by the same methods that ultimately destroyed him adds another layer of complexity to his historical significance. Henry VIII's eventual regret about Cromwell's execution serves as a final testament to the administrator's genuine value and the short-sightedness of his destruction. The king's admission that he had been poorly served by those who counseled Cromwell's death came too late to save his former minister, but provides historical validation of his competence. The administrative chaos that followed his execution demonstrated the difficulty of replacing truly capable servants, regardless of their political vulnerabilities. The enduring fascination with Thomas Cromwell's story reflects its embodiment of universal themes about ambition, power, and human nature. His rise from humble origins to the highest levels of government speaks to the possibilities inherent in talent and determination, while his swift destruction reminds us of the precarious nature of worldly success. In the end, his terrifying final days serve as both a historical curiosity and a timeless meditation on the costs of political participation and the dangerous allure of absolute power.